Officer Thomas Mitchell had been guarding the royal family for 12 years. He knew every corner of Windsor Castle, every daily routine, and every security protocol by heart. Standing tall in his crisp uniform, he watched over the royal children with the same dedication he had shown since joining the Royal Protection Unit. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The autumn sun filtered through the grand windows as Prince George walked down the marble corridor with his tutor, heading to his morning lessons. Thomas stood at his usual position near the library entrance, his trained eyes scanning the surroundings while keeping a respectful distance from the young prince. Prince George, now 11 years old, had grown into a thoughtful boy who carried himself with quiet dignity. Unlike his younger siblings who were still carefree and playful, George seemed to understand the weight of his future role. He rarely spoke to the guards directly, maintaining the formal distance that royal protocol demanded. As they approached the library, George's tutor, Mrs. Henderson, stopped to speak with another staff member about the day's schedule. The prince stood patiently, his hands clasped behind his back in the way he had been taught. Thomas noticed how the boy's eyes wandered around the corridor, taking in details that most children his age would ignore. The castle was quieter than usual that morning. The king and queen were away on official duties, and Prince William and Catherine were attending a charity event in London. Only the essential staff remained, creating an atmosphere of calm routine that everyone had grown comfortable with. Thomas had always prided himself on his ability to read people and situations. It was a skill that had served him well in his military career before joining the Royal Protection Team. He could sense tension, spot potential threats, and anticipate problems before they developed. But that morning, something felt different, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. Prince George glanced in his direction, and for a moment, their eyes met. The boy's expression was serious, almost contemplative, as if he were studying Thomas with the same attention that Thomas used to observe his surroundings. It was unusual for the prince to make such direct eye contact with the guards, and it caught Thomas off guard. The moment passed quickly as Mrs. Henderson finished her conversation and gestured for the prince to continue to the library. George nodded politely to Thomas before walking away, but there was something in that brief interaction that stayed with the guard long after the prince had disappeared through the library. Thomas had encountered many members of the royal family during his years of service. He had learned to read their moods, understand their preferences, and anticipate their needs without them having to ask. But Prince George had always been different. Even as a young child, he possessed an awareness that seemed beyond his years, as if he understood that every action, every word, and every gesture would someday carry the weight of the crown. The morning progressed without incident. Thomas continued his rounds, checking security points and coordinating with other guards, but he found his thoughts returning to that moment in the corridor. There had been something in Prince George's eyes, a kind of understanding that seemed to go beyond the usual polite acknowledgement between a royal and their protection officer. As lunchtime approached, Thomas received word that his shift would be extended due to a last-minute change in the security schedule. Another guard had called in sick, and they needed additional coverage for the afternoon activities. He accepted the assignment without complaint, as he always did, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this day would be different from all the others. The castle's ancient walls had witnessed centuries of history, countless moments of triumph and tragedy, love and loss. Thomas often wondered what stories these stones could tell if they could speak. Today, he had the strange sense that he was about to become part of one of those stories, though he had no idea how or why. During his lunch break, Thomas sat in the staff dining room, reviewing the afternoon schedule. Prince George was expected to have tea with his grandmother, followed by a music lesson and then some free time in the garden. It was a typical afternoon for a royal child, carefully structured yet allowing for moments of normal childhood activities. Other guards chatted around him about weekend plans and family news, but Thomas found himself distracted. He kept thinking about the prince's expression that morning, trying to understand what had made it so memorable. In all his years of service, he had maintained professional boundaries while developing a genuine care for the family he protected. But something about today felt like it was challenging those boundaries in ways he didn't fully comprehend. The afternoon brought unexpected rain, forcing Prince George's garden time to be moved indoors. Thomas was assigned to watch over the East Wing drawing room where the prince had decided to spend his free time reading, and working on a puzzle. The room was one of George's favorites, with large windows that offered a view of the gardens even when the weather didn't permit outdoor activities. Thomas positioned himself near the doorway, close enough to ensure security but far enough to give the prince privacy. He watched as George carefully arranged puzzle pieces on a small table, occasionally glancing up from his work to look out at the rain-soaked gardens. The boy seemed lost in thought more so than usual. The drawing room had always been a peaceful space in the castle. Ancient portraits of past kings and queens lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch over the current generation of royals. Thomas had spent countless hours in this room over the years, observing various family members as they relaxed in what was considered their most informal space. But today felt different somehow. After about 30 minutes, Prince George stood up from his puzzle and walked to the bookshelf. Instead of selecting a book, he turned and looked directly at Thomas. This time, the eye contact lasted longer than a polite glance. The prince seemed to be making a decision about something, weighing his options in the careful way he had learned from observing his father and grandfather. "Officer Mitchell," Prince George said quietly, breaking the formal silence that usually surrounded their interactions. Thomas straightened slightly, surprised to be addressed directly.
"Yes, Your Royal Highness?"
The prince walked closer but maintained a respectful distance. His footsteps were soft on the thick carpet, and Thomas noticed how the boy carried himself with increasing maturity each day. At 11 years old, George was already showing signs of the thoughtful leader he would someday become. "May I ask you something?" the prince inquired, his voice carrying a weight that seemed beyond his years. "Of course, sir," Thomas replied, though he felt uncertain about where this conversation might lead. Direct conversations between guards and royal family members were unusual, especially with the children. His training had prepared him for many situations, but not for deep personal discussions with the future king. George looked down at his hands briefly, gathering courage for what he wanted to say. When he looked back up at Thomas, his expression held that same serious intensity from the morning. "Do you ever think about what it would be like to have a different life?" The question struck Thomas like lightning. It was far more personal and philosophical than anything he had expected from the 11-year-old prince. He considered his response carefully, aware that this was not a typical interaction, and that anything he said could have implications beyond this moment. The rain continued pattering against the windows, creating a cocoon of privacy around their unexpected conversation. "I think everyone wonders about different paths sometimes, sir," Thomas answered honestly, choosing his words with care. "It's natural to be curious about other possibilities." Prince George nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something he had already suspected. His eyes held a wisdom that Thomas had noticed growing stronger over the past few months. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," he said, moving to stand near the window where raindrops traced meandering paths down the glass. "About choices and paths and what it means when some paths are chosen for you before you're even born." Thomas felt the profound weight in the boy's words. The prince was articulating something that most adults struggle to understand about the nature of destiny versus choice. Here was a child who had never known the freedom to dream about becoming anything other than what he was born to be, wrestling with concepts that philosophers had debated for centuries. The silence stretched between them for a moment, filled only by the gentle sound of rain and the distant ticking of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. Thomas could see the prince's reflection in the window glass, superimposed over the view of the gardens where he should have been playing if the weather had cooperated. "Sometimes," Prince George continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I wonder what it would be like to just walk away from all of this and be ordinary." The admission hung in the air between them like a delicate soap bubble that might burst if either of them breathed too hard. Thomas understood that he was witnessing a moment of profound vulnerability from someone who rarely had the opportunity to express such thoughts. The prince was sharing something he probably couldn't say to his parents or siblings, something that could only be spoken to someone who was both close enough to understand and distant enough to be safe. Thomas looked at the young boy standing by the window and saw not just the future king, but a child struggling with questions that had no easy answers. The privilege and luxury that surrounded Prince George came with chains that most people never saw or understood. "I imagine that would be both freeing and frightening, sir," Thomas replied carefully, his voice gentle with understanding. To have that kind of choice would be a gift, but also a tremendous responsibility. George turned from the window and smiled slightly, the first real smile Thomas had seen from him all day. It transformed his face from serious and burdened to genuinely boyish for just a moment. You understand, don't you? Most people see the privilege and the luxury, but they don't see the cage. The word cage hit Thomas harder than he expected. He had served this family for 12 years, had watched Prince George grow from a toddler into this thoughtful young man, but he had never fully considered how the boy might experience his own life. The protection, the protocol, the constant supervision that Thomas saw as necessary security measures, the prince experienced as bars on a prison of golden luxury. I've watched you, Officer Mitchell, Prince George said, surprising Thomas once again with the depth of his observation. For years I've watched how you move through your duties, how you carry yourself, how you seem to find purpose in service to others. But I've also noticed something else. Thomas waited, feeling exposed under the prince's perceptive gaze. The boy had been studying him with the same careful attention that Thomas used to assess security threats and potential dangers. It was unsettling to realize he had been observed so closely without his awareness. You seem like someone who chose this life, who found meaning in protecting people. That's different from having a life chosen for you, isn't it? The insight was remarkable for someone so young. Thomas realized that Prince George had been observing all the guards and staff not just as servants, but as examples of people who had made active choices about their lives and careers. The prince was trying to understand what it meant to choose your own path by studying those around him who had done exactly that. Yes, sir, it is different, Thomas acknowledged, feeling the truth of his words resonate in his chest. I joined the military and then the protection service because I wanted to serve something larger than myself. It was my choice, and that made all the difference in how I approached the work. The conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Henderson's arrival to escort Prince George to his music lesson. The prince thanked Thomas politely and left the room, but not before giving him one more meaningful look that seemed to say their conversation was far from over. Thomas remained in the drawing room for several minutes after they left, processing what had just happened. Over the next few days, Thomas found himself paying closer attention to Prince George's behavior. The boy seemed to be watching him too, creating a strange new dynamic in their professional relationship. During formal events and daily routines, they maintained the proper protocol. But there was an underlying awareness between them that hadn't existed before. It was during a family dinner that Thomas noticed the subtle change in Prince George's demeanor. The prince sat at the table with perfect posture, engaged in conversation with his parents and siblings, but Thomas could see the effort it required. The boy who had spoken so openly about feeling caged now appeared to be consciously performing the role of the future king, even during a private family meal. After dinner, as the family moved to the sitting room for their evening routine, Prince George approached Thomas again. This time, there was an urgency in his manner that hadn't been there before. Officer Mitchell, could I speak with you privately for a moment? The prince asked quietly. Thomas glanced around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard and nodded. They stepped into a small alcove near the sitting room where they could talk without drawing attention from the other family members or staff. I've been thinking about our conversation, Prince George began, his voice barely above a whisper. About choices and paths and what it means to find your own purpose. Thomas waited, sensing that the prince had something specific he wanted to say. I've made a decision, George continued, his young face set with determination. I want to understand what it's like to choose a different path, even if it's just for a short time. I want to know what it feels like to be ordinary, to make decisions based on what I want rather than what's expected of me. Thomas felt a chill run through him as he began to understand where this conversation was heading. Sir, I'm not sure I follow. I want you to help me, Prince George said directly. I want to leave here, just for a few hours, and experience what it's like to be a normal boy. No guards, no protocols, no one knowing who I am. The request hit Thomas like a physical blow. The prince was asking him to violate every protocol he had sworn to uphold, to betray the trust that the royal family had placed in him, and to put the future king in potential danger. It was unthinkable. Your Royal Highness, Thomas said carefully, what you're suggesting is impossible. My duty is to protect you, and I cannot— Please, Prince George interrupted, and the simple word carried such weight that Thomas felt his resolve waver. I'm not asking you to abandon your duty. I'm asking you to help me understand what choice feels like before I lose the opportunity forever." Thomas looked into the boy's eyes and saw a desperation that broke his heart. Prince George wasn't being reckless or rebellious. He was a young person facing the reality of a life without personal freedom, asking for just a taste of what he would never have. "I've thought about this carefully," the prince continued. "I know the risks and I know what I'm asking of you. But I also know that you're the only person I trust enough to help me do this safely." The weight of the prince's trust was both an honor and a burden. Thomas realized that refusing might crush something vital in the boy's spirit. But agreeing would require him to make a choice that could end his career and potentially put the prince in danger. "What exactly are you proposing, sir?" Thomas asked, surprised by his own words. He hadn't meant to entertain the idea, but the prince's earnestness was compelling. Prince George's eyes brightened with hope. "Tomorrow afternoon, during my free time, I want to walk through the village like a normal boy. No security detail, no special treatment. Just me, experiencing what it's like to be anonymous." Thomas's mind raced through all the things that could go wrong. The security risks were enormous. The breach of protocol was unprecedented, and the consequences if they were discovered would be severe for both of them. "I would need time to think about this, sir," Thomas said finally. "This is not a decision I can make lightly." Prince George nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was asking. "I know it's a lot to ask, but Officer Mitchell, I'm going to be king someday. I'll spend my entire life serving others and following rules that were made before I was born. This might be my only chance to understand what I'm asking my future subjects to trust me with." The prince's reasoning was mature beyond his years, and Thomas found himself considering the request more seriously than he should have. He saw the boy's point about needing to understand the lives of ordinary people if he was going to rule them effectively someday. "If I were to consider this," Thomas said slowly, "it would have to be completely secret, and there would have to be conditions to ensure your safety." Prince George nodded eagerly. "Whatever conditions you think are necessary. I trust your judgment completely." Thomas looked at the earnest young face before him and realized that he was about to make a decision that would change both of their lives forever. That night, Thomas lay awake staring at the ceiling of his small apartment near the castle. Every logical part of his mind told him to refuse Prince George's request and report the conversation to his superiors. But another part of him, the part that had been moved by the boy's honesty and desperation, kept considering how it might be possible to grant this wish safely. By morning, Thomas had developed a plan that might work, though it violated every protocol he had ever learned. The key would be timing and careful preparation. Prince George's free time was typically supervised but not intensively monitored, especially when he was supposed to be in his private quarters reading or resting. When Thomas saw the prince at breakfast, he gave a subtle nod that communicated his decision. Prince George's face remained perfectly composed, but Thomas caught the flash of gratitude and excitement in his eyes. Later that morning, during a brief moment when they were alone, Thomas outlined his conditions. "1 hour only," he said quietly. "You wear ordinary clothes and keep your head down. We stay in the small village nearby where people are less likely to recognize you, and if anything feels unsafe, we leave immediately." Prince George agreed to every condition without hesitation. They arranged to meet at a service entrance that Thomas knew would be unmonitored during the afternoon shift change. The prince would tell his staff he was tired and wanted to rest quietly in his room, which would buy them the time they needed. The afternoon seemed to drag endlessly as Thomas waited for the appointed time. He had obtained casual clothes that would fit the prince and identified a route through the village that would minimize their exposure while still giving George the experience he craved. At exactly 3 o'clock, Thomas met Prince George at the service entrance. The transformation was remarkable. Dressed in jeans, a simple sweater, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, the future king looked like any other 11-year-old boy. His posture was different too, less formal and more relaxed than Thomas had ever seen him. They walked quietly through the staff corridors and out through a gate that led directly to the village path. With each step away from the castle, Thomas felt both terror and exhilaration. He was violating his oath, risking his career, and potentially endangering the prince. But he was also giving a young boy something precious that he would never have another chance to experience. The village was sleepy that afternoon. With only a few people walking along the main street, Prince George walked beside Thomas, his eyes wide with wonder at this simple scene that most people took for granted. He watched shopkeepers arranging their displays, children playing in a small park, and elderly residents chatting on benches. "It's so normal," the prince whispered, and Thomas could hear the amazement in his voice. "Everyone is just living their lives without thinking about it." They stopped at a small cafe where Thomas bought them both hot chocolate. Prince George sat at a corner table observing the other customers with fascination. A group of teenagers at another table were laughing loudly about something from school. A mother was trying to convince her toddler to eat his lunch while balancing a baby on her hip. An elderly man was reading a newspaper while his small dog waited patiently at his feet. "Do you see how they're all dealing with their own problems and joys?" Prince George asked quietly. "The mother is tired but patient with her children. The teenagers are worried about things that probably seem silly to adults but matter so much to them right now. The old man looks content but maybe a little lonely." Thomas was struck by the prince's perceptive observations. Even in this brief glimpse of ordinary life, George was learning about his future subjects in a way that no formal education could teach him. They left the cafe and walked through the village square where a small market was in progress. Prince George watched vendors selling fresh vegetables, homemade crafts, and local specialties. He was particularly fascinated by a young boy about his own age who was helping his father sell flowers from their garden. "Excuse me," the prince said to the flower vendor, making Thomas's heart race. "Could I buy some flowers for my mother?" The man smiled at what he assumed was just another local child. "Of course, son. What kind would she like?" Prince George carefully selected a small bouquet of daisies and roses, paying with money Thomas had given him. The vendor's natural, casual interaction with the prince was exactly what George had been hoping to experience. For those few minutes, he was just a boy buying flowers for his mother, not the future King of England. As they walked back toward the castle, Prince George was unusually quiet. Thomas could see that the experience had affected him deeply, giving him insights into the lives of ordinary people that would stay with him forever. "Thank you," the prince said simply as they approached the service entrance. "I know what you risked for me today, and I'll never forget it." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of what they had done and what it might mean for both of their futures. "It was worth it to see you experience that, sir." But as they prepared to re-enter the castle grounds, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. A security camera above the service entrance was positioned differently than it had been when they left, and there was a figure waiting in the shadows near the door. The figure stepped out of the shadows, and Thomas's worst fears were confirmed. It was Chief Inspector Williams, the head of Royal Security, whose stern expression left no doubt that their unauthorized excursion had been discovered. Thomas instinctively moved slightly in front of Prince George, though he knew there was no protecting either of them from the consequences of what they had done. "Your Royal Highness." "Officer Mitchell," Chief Inspector Williams said formally, his voice carrying the weight of serious disappointment. "I believe we need to have a conversation immediately." Prince George stepped forward, his chin raised with royal dignity despite his casual clothes. "Chief Inspector, Officer Mitchell was following my direct orders. If there are consequences to be faced, they should fall on me alone." Thomas felt a surge of pride and concern at the prince's brave attempt to protect him, even as he knew it would make no difference. The breach of protocol was so severe that both of their fates were already sealed. They were escorted through quiet corridors to Chief Inspector Williams' office, where the atmosphere was tense and formal. Williams took his seat behind his desk while Thomas stood at attention, and Prince George sat in a chair with perfect posture, every inch the future king despite his ordinary clothes. "I'm disappointed beyond words," Williams began, his gaze moving between them. "Officer Mitchell, you have violated every oath you took when you joined this protection unit. Your Royal Highness, you have put yourself in danger and compromised the security of the entire royal family." Prince George spoke first, his voice clear and steady. "Chief Inspector, I take full responsibility for what happened today. I convinced Officer Mitchell to help me experience what it's like to be an ordinary person. He was reluctant and only agreed because I insisted. His only thought was for my safety and well-being." Thomas watched the 11-year-old boy defend him with a maturity and courage that was remarkable. Despite his young age, Prince George understood the gravity of the situation and was willing to face the consequences of his choices. The security breach is inexcusable. Williams continued. We have protocols for a reason, and when they are ignored, lives are put at risk. Officer Mitchell, you will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Your career in royal protection is over. The words hit Thomas like physical blows, but he had expected them. He had known the risks when he agreed to help Prince George, and he had made his choice with full awareness of the likely consequences. However, Williams continued, surprising them both, there are some factors that must be considered before final decisions are made. He opened a file on his desk and looked at Prince George seriously. Your Royal Highness, this is not the first time you have expressed concerns about your future role and the constraints it places on your life. Your parents have been aware of your struggles, and they have asked me to handle this situation with special consideration for your emotional well-being. Prince George's composed facade cracked slightly, revealing the vulnerable boy beneath the royal training. My parents know. They know that you have been asking questions about choice and freedom, and they understand that you are grappling with the weight of your future responsibilities, Williams explained. They also know that you would not have acted without careful thought, and that you trusted Officer Mitchell enough to involve him in your plan. Thomas felt confused by this turn in the conversation. He had expected immediate dismissal and possibly criminal charges, not this measured discussion of the prince's emotional needs. Williams turned to Thomas. Officer Mitchell, your violation of protocol cannot be overlooked or excused. However, your years of exemplary service and the prince's testimony about your reluctance and careful safety precautions have been noted. More importantly, the prince has specifically requested that you not be punished for helping him. I understand the seriousness of what I did, Thomas replied. I accept whatever consequences are appropriate. The consequences will be significant, Williams confirmed. You cannot continue in your current role. The trust required for royal protection has been compromised, and that cannot be overlooked. Prince George leaned forward in his chair. Chief Inspector, what if I formally requested Officer Mitchell's reassignment rather than his dismissal? He has served our family faithfully for 12 years, and today he showed me kindness and understanding when I needed it most. William studied the prince carefully. What kind of reassignment did you have in mind, Your Royal Highness? Officer Mitchell helped me understand something important today, Prince George said thoughtfully. He showed me that serving others can be a choice made with purpose and meaning, not just an obligation. I think he would be valuable in helping train other young people who want to serve their country. Thomas looked at the prince with amazement. Even in this moment of crisis, George was thinking about others and looking for constructive solutions, rather than simply trying to avoid punishment. Williams closed the file and sat back in his chair. Your Royal Highness, your parents have asked me to inform you that they would like to discuss today's events with you privately. They are not angry, but they want to understand what you learned and how they can better support you as you prepare for your future role. He turned to Thomas. Officer Mitchell, you will be transferred to the Royal Military Academy, where you will help train the next generation of security personnel. It's a demotion in terms of prestige, but it allows you to continue serving while maintaining some recognition of your years of faithful service. Thomas felt a mixture of relief and loss. He would miss protecting the royal family, but he was grateful to avoid complete disgrace and to have the opportunity to continue serving in some capacity. 3 months later, Thomas stood in front of a classroom filled with young military cadets who were training to become protection officers. As he looked at their eager faces, he often thought about that afternoon, when Prince George had asked him to help experience ordinary life. The experience had changed both of them in ways that were still unfolding. His new position at the Royal Military Academy was different from his previous role, but Thomas found unexpected satisfaction in teaching young people about service, duty, and the delicate balance between following orders and understanding the human needs behind them. His story had become legendary among the trainees, though the official version was carefully edited to protect Prince George's privacy. Thomas had received one letter from Prince George since his reassignment. The prince wrote that he had had long conversations with his parents about his future role, and that they were working together to find ways for him to connect with ordinary people through his royal duties. The experience in the village had helped him articulate what he needed from his education and preparation for kingship. The letter also mentioned that Prince George was learning more about the lives of his future subjects through carefully planned community visits and interactions with young people his own age from different backgrounds. His parents had realized that their son's desire to understand ordinary life was not rebellion, but rather a mature recognition of what would make him a better future king. In his teaching, Thomas often used the lessons he had learned from that day with Prince George. He taught his students that true service sometimes required understanding the human being behind the title, that protecting someone meant more than just ensuring their physical safety, and that sometimes the greatest risk was in refusing to take any risk at all. One particular lesson always resonated with his students. Thomas would tell them about a young person who had taught him that courage could look like asking for help, that wisdom sometimes came from the youngest voices, and that the most important protection they could offer someone was the safety to be vulnerable and honest about their needs. The cadets were always curious about the details of his royal service, but Thomas kept the most important parts of his story private. Some experiences were too precious and too personal to share, even in service of education. On quiet evenings in his new quarters, Thomas would sometimes think about Prince George and wonder how the boy was growing into his role. He had heard through unofficial channels that the prince was thriving, that his confidence had grown, and that his understanding of his future subjects was deeper than that of previous royal children his age. Thomas never regretted his decision to help Prince George that day. Yes, it had cost him his position and changed the trajectory of his career, but it had also given him something invaluable, the knowledge that he had helped a young person in need, that he had contributed to the development of someone who would someday lead their country, the subtle cue that had started it all, that moment when Prince George had looked at him with such directness and trust had led to a conversation that changed both of their lives. The prince had needed to understand what choice felt like, and Thomas had needed to understand what it meant to truly serve someone's deepest needs rather than just their official requirements. In his new role, Thomas often encountered young people who were struggling with questions about their purpose and their place in the world. When he saw that familiar look of uncertainty and searching, he remembered Prince George's courage in asking for help and his own decision to respond with compassion rather than rigid adherence to rules. The village where they had spent that precious hour had no idea that they had briefly hosted their future king. The flower vendor continued selling his blooms, the cafe served hot chocolate to local children, and life went on in its beautifully ordinary way. But for Thomas and Prince George, those simple moments had been transformative. Thomas had learned that sometimes the most profound service required breaking the rules in service of a higher purpose. Prince George had learned that understanding his future subjects required more than studying reports about them. It required experiencing life from their perspective, even if only briefly. Years later, when Prince George became king and began implementing policies that showed an unusual understanding of ordinary people's lives, Thomas would read about them in the newspaper and smile. He knew that somewhere in those wise decisions was a trace of that afternoon, when a young prince had experienced what it meant to be just another boy in a village, buying flowers for his mother and watching people live their beautifully ordinary lives. The subtle cue that had prompted Thomas to leave his watch had been Prince George's recognition that some experiences are worth any risk, and some understanding can only be gained by stepping outside the boundaries that normally define us. In helping the prince gain that understanding, Thomas had discovered something equally valuable about the true meaning of service, and the courage required to serve not just protocol, but the human heart.